Well, as you probably imagine from the title of the talk, I'm going to be talking a bit about the Hemisphere Hypothesis, which is laid out at some length in The Master and His Emissary, and as Satish never ceases to remind me, at much greater length in The Matter with Things, which is my latest book, subtitled Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World, which I believe we're busily engaging in, and that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. I'm not going to try and explain why I believe the things I believe, because there isn't time, so I'm just going to give you the punchlines, as it were, and if you want to know more, as I say, I have written about these things at very great length. So just a very quick introduction to the idea of the Hemisphere Hypothesis, which was an attempt to answer the question, why is this brain that is solely powerful because of the connections it makes divided so comprehensively down the middle with just a small band of fibers at the base connecting the two parts? Why are the two halves of the brain asymmetrical? And why is much of the traffic across this band of fibers, known as the corpus callosum, inhibitory in its effect? There seems to be something important going on about separation of two ways of looking at the world. My hypothesis is that this has developed because of a need that all living creatures have to be able to get but not be got. And in fact, every neural network we know, going back to the most ancient network in any living creature, 700 million years old, Nematostella vectensis, shows an asymmetry in the network, and it's been described as the origin of the mammalian brain, ultimately, and therefore of our brains. That requires the brain to do two things at once. One is to pay very narrowly focused, targeted attention to a precise detail, which is the thing you want to grab, the piece of food, the twig to build a nest, whatever it is, in order to manipulate the world to your benefit. But at the same time, you must be keeping a completely different kind of attention to the world open, otherwise you will become someone else's lunch while you're getting yours. So you have to be on the lookout for predators, but also for your kin, for everything that is going on in the other 357 degrees of the surround that are not encompassed in this narrow targeted attention, which comes from the left hemisphere. In brief, attention is extremely important because it's not just another brain function. It's what creates the experiential world that we all inhabit. We help make the world what it is. And the kind of attention we pay governs what kind of thing we find the world to be, as well as making a difference to who we are. So the kinds of attention we pay changes us and changes the world. In other words, attention is a moral act. What comes out is that from this very narrow beam piecemeal attention, the left hemisphere sees a world of details that are isolated, known, familiar, certain, fixed, abstracted from their context, made explicit, disembodied, general in nature, and reduced to its parts. Whereas the right hemisphere sees, by contrast, that everything is actually fresh, unique, and never fully known, never finally certain, but full of potential. It understands all that is implicit, that nothing is ever merely static and unchanging, but flowing and radically interconnected. It understands that parts are the left hemisphere's invention, and that what are seen as parts are already wholes at another level. But there are two differences that I want to focus on for tonight. One is that the left hemisphere is preferentially interested in tools and machines, which are coded in all our brains, even if we're left-handers, using our left hand to operate tools and machines. Even in left-handers, the majority, and certainly in right-handers, tools and machines are coded in the left hemisphere. Whereas the right hemisphere has a tendency to see an animate world, and you can experimentally knock out one hemisphere at a time. And with the left hemisphere quieted or suppressed, the right hemisphere sees the world as composed of animate objects. It sees the sun as animate. It sees a stone as having atoms in it that are moving and dancing. The other difference, which may not strike you as very remarkable to begin with, but is ultimately probably of the greatest importance, is that between a world which presences to us and a world which is represented by us. This is the difference between the world that we experience if the right hemisphere is able to still the chatter of monkey mind in the left hemisphere and actually be present for once as the world comes into being for us. The difference between that and the theory, the map, the diagram that the left hemisphere holds. And the trouble is that if you use the left hemisphere's way of looking at the world, you soon begin to believe that the theories, the maps, the diagrams are the reality, and all the complexity of the real world disappears. Now, there is a difference, obviously, I've alerted you to this, between the reliability of the left hemisphere and its denial of reality. There are three ways in which I would draw your attention to this. The first is that if somebody has a right hemisphere stroke, they may have a paralyzed left half of the body, at least often a paralyzed left arm, possibly the whole of the left side of the body. But it's very common, more common than not, for them to deny that there is any problem. This doesn't work the other way around. If you have a left hemisphere stroke, the sufferer immediately is aware that something is wrong and is appropriately distressed about it, but not the other way around. And you can ask somebody who has a right hemisphere stroke to move their left arm, and of course they can't, but they say, there. And you say, well, we didn't see anything move, did you? No, we didn't see anything move. And you bring the arm right round in front of them and say, move that. And they say, oh, that's my mother's arm, or it's your arm, doctor, or it's the patient next to me's arm. But never to accept that there is something wrong with the self. And some clever psychologists have managed to interview, as it were, each hemisphere separately and give them a personality inventory to fill out and give them the same personality inventory to friends and relatives. And what transpires is that the left hemisphere has a remarkably high opinion of itself compared with what other people think, whereas the right hemisphere tends to be a little bit on the downside, but is much closer to reality. So there's that. Quite separately, and in the first part of the first volume of The Matter with Things, I am at pains to evaluate how much the left hemisphere is able to clock reality compared with the right. And I look at attention, which I've mentioned, but also perception, which is not the same as attention, the judgments you make on the basis of what you see and attend to. In other words, you can believe things that are right, or you can be deluded. On looking at emotional and social intelligence, looking at cognitive intelligence, which may surprise some people, looking at creativity. All of these are ways in which we bring the world into being for us. In every case, the right hemisphere is more veridical, more accurate, better able to gauge things than the left. And so hallucinations and delusions are very preponderantly more following left hemisphere, following right hemisphere damage than following left. And then there is the fact that the left hemisphere, having a theory about things, wants everything to fit into that theory. And so its criterion is not whether it responds to experience, but whether it responds to the map or the diagram. Internal consistency. And a lovely piece of research I must describe to you, which was carried out in the mid-1990s by Marcel Kinsborn, who's a venerable Anglo-American neuroscientist, and a Russian colleague, Deglin. And they had patients with one hemisphere at a time knocked out. And they asked them to comment on a syllogism. Now, a syllogism is a couple of premises that lead one to a conclusion. The classic one used in philosophy is all men are mortal, Socrates is a man. The conclusion, Socrates is mortal. But these syllogisms had a little twist. One of the premises was false. So, winter is cold in tropical countries. This is not true. Ecuador is a tropical country. True. Is it cold in winter in Ecuador or not? Now, interestingly, the two hemispheres of the same person respond quite differently to this question. So when the right hemisphere is asked to comment, the subject shrugs her shoulders and says, winter's not cold in tropical countries. It's a lie. But when the left hemisphere of the very same individual is asked about it, she reads quickly and answers immediately, it's cold in winter in Ecuador because Ecuador is a tropical country. The examiner says, Ecuador is a tropical country, then can it be cold there? No, it can't be, since it is a tropical country. Then the same syllogism is presented again. She replies, it is cold in winter in Ecuador because Ecuador is a tropical country. The examiner says, but you do know that it's not so. She replies, but that's what's written here. In other words, does that ring any bells in the modern era in which what it says on the piece of paper, on the form you filled out, is more important than what actually happens in real life? Now, why does all this matter? You might say, I lead my life perfectly happily. I don't need to know which bits of my brain are working at any time. It doesn't add anything. However, if we are able, and I demonstrate that we can, see the imprint of the way the left hemisphere understands the world and the way the right hemisphere understands the world, we can begin to evaluate philosophical arguments. In the past, up till now, people have been content to say, well, some philosophers say this and some philosophers say that. Take your pick. But now, I believe, we can say this picture of the world is quite typical of how the left hemisphere would see it. This picture is more like the right hemisphere would see it. It doesn't mean to say the left hemisphere picture has no applicability. It doesn't tell us, it's not as though it doesn't tell us something. It tells us something. But overall, we don't want to be following its judgment. Now, as we lead life headlong, as in the past most people did. They didn't have to engage on Twitter with an argument with people on the other side of the world in 180 characters. We were more embedded in the environment where we were, in the social networks where we were, in the rites and rituals of our religion, of the way of life, and we were therefore had a much greater grounding in all the things the right hemisphere is able to speak to us about. But in the modern era, certainly in the last 200 or 300 years, there has become a sort of deracinated public debate in which you score low if you contradict yourself. Well, that's not consistent, so that can't be right. Unfortunately, I'm not going to go into that tonight, it's quite clear that in the deep structure of reality, opposites coincide. And so if you're truly aware of things, you will find that in ordinary speech, you seem to be contradicting yourself, whereas in fact what you're striving to do is to show that there are two aspects to this. So in the world in which we talk, it's much easier to express the left hemisphere's point of view because it's simple, reductionist, mechanistic. Nothing makes any sense. It's all bits of matter that just collide, and anybody else is dreaming. They're just not in touch with reality. That is an easier case to make than to say, actually, the implicit things are what are important, not the explicit. That actually there are things you can't see and touch, which are still very real, perhaps more real than the things you can see and touch, and you can see what I'm getting at here. That this right hemisphere's take on things is far more subtle, far more complicated, far truer to life, but far harder to articulate. That is the world I believe we've gone into, and that's why I say we need to rebalance the hemispheres. At the moment, the left hemisphere is having it all its own way, and the right hemisphere hasn't got a voice. I mean, literally, the right hemisphere is not where speech comes from. Speech comes from the left hemisphere. And so this is a problem for us. And I believe that, in fact, in the mythologies of many countries that I've looked at around the world, of India, of China, Japan, of the Native American peoples, of the circumpolar peoples, and so forth, there are myths which suggests that there are two forces, and one of them is more powerful and more knowing and more benign than the other. But the one that knows less thinks it knows everything and is resentful of the greater power and tries to usurp it. This is an ancient story that we all tell ourselves, which is ourselves understanding how our mind works from the inside. But now there is plenty of neuroscience, if you need it, that validates this point. Now, where this leads, it seems to me, and what I want to focus on now, it leads to many things, but I want to highlight for tonight what I call the attack on life, which I feel is going on apace in our civilization. The left hemisphere's raison d'etre is to manipulate and to control, to master things. It wants power. Its whole raison d'etre is to be able to move things, to make things, to turn the world to its own will. And this assertion of control seems to have taken over the whole of the westernized world and possibly now spread to the rest of the world. This desire for the only respect is for what is powerful, not what might be more vulnerable, what might be more beautiful, what might be more true or good, but simply what is represented as power. And in fact, I say in The Master and His Hemisphere that beauty has been airbrushed out of the picture now, like a Russian general who's fallen from grace and has been removed from the pictures. The mentality of the left hemisphere is such that it must believe that it is in control of everything, and therefore what it receives is something it has been part of making. It has made the world the way it is, and it has the right to use it in any way. So nature becomes resource, becomes a utility, and there's much more besides. Nature itself, as we know, is being destroyed by this mechanistic attitude in which nature is simply there to provide stuff for us to use for our own pleasure and needs. Equally, we take an attitude to the human nature, that it's something sort of like a machine, in fact, not like a very good machine. Some people seem to believe that a computer would actually not have the failings we have, and therefore we're presented as slightly imperfect or very imperfect computers, rather than the idea that a computer is a very poor simulation of what we as human beings manage to do. And human nature and the body have become up for grabs. It's all the way we want it, and we control it and command it. There is no respect for what nature has given us there. And there is a denial of all that cannot be measured and all that is merely experiential. Well, excuse me, everything is experiential that we know. There's nothing merely about the experiential. There's a small subset of things that can be viewed artificially from the outside, but we cannot get behind or beyond experience. And in the place of nature and its infinite complexities and its wisdom, we see the rise of the virtual and the rise of the bureaucratic. On the virtual, let me explain that with right hemisphere damage, the world literally seems two-dimensional. It seems like projections on a two-dimensional screen. And we're all interacting with these two-dimensional screens now every day in our lives. Interestingly, one loses depth in time as well when the right hemisphere is damaged, and depth in emotion, but that's something I can't go into now. On the question of the bureaucratic, bureaucracies are an exemplification of a certain linear, systematic, categorical, abstract way of dealing with human situations, which civilizations adopt when they have overreached themselves, so that they are no longer in touch with the people, as it were. You are now dealing with an empire, a military empire, an economic empire, as in the case of the modern West and so forth. But something is rolled out, as we say, which is incredibly cumbersome. And this bureaucratic mind is growing apace. Year by year, I can see now that 2 years ago, it was far easier to do many of the daily processes that one has to do. They took only a few minutes. Certainly in the days when you could lift a telephone and speak to a person, they took 5 minutes. Now they can actually take 4 hours because the computer isn't responding the way you want it to. It says, oops, something went wrong, which is not a very helpful remark. One would like some indication of what to do better if one needs to try harder. But this is the way life is becoming. It's wasteful of time and energy. It's enormously wasteful of money and resource. We need to thin down management, thin down administration, thin down bureaucracy, and trust people more. Way back in the 1940s, the philosopher Adorno described our world as die verwaltete Welt, which means the administered world. He was already seeing it in the 1940s, before I was born. But golly, in my lifetime, I've seen this come on very rapidly. And what's interesting is we have the illusion of being in control, where there's really, in truth, very little we can control. Rather, we are controlled. And it's not one where the bureaucrats are in control, as in some conspiracy theory. They themselves are also the victims of this administrative mentality. It's a self-legitimating bureaucracy, a self-legitimizing process. And it's not that bureaucrats are our new slave masters. That's not what I'm saying. They themselves are enslaved by the very bureaucracy that none of us seem able to escape. I found this comment by philosopher of law Ryan Mead in an article sent to me a day or two ago. And really, he's just reiterating what Aristotle already knew, that vice always comes to us disguised as virtue. No exceptions, he says. So we can all be deluded into thinking that something that is very good can, in fact, be very damaging. And that's not just something that Aristotle said, but because he wouldn't have believed in the coincidence of opposites. But when you realize there is a coincidence of opposites, you can see that the more extreme you get in a certain position, the more you approximate the very position you were running away from. The two extremes are much more alike than the position which holds these two in a careful balance, which is what I'm suggesting we might try to espouse. And this is what Jung constantly referred to. He called it Enantiodromia, which just means moving in opposite directions, that everything good has a dark side and everything dark has a good side, and it's just that we don't see it at the time. So it has this move that we seem unaware of almost, but certainly not in control of, that controls us. Has it made us happy? Has becoming affluent, has becoming sort of having our every need handed to you, has this made us happier people, more fulfilled people? The data seem to suggest no. Satisfaction and happiness ratings in all modern societies that have been researched have declined as they have become more prosperous and more westernized. The decline has been particularly steep among women. Over the 35 years between 1970 and 2005, women's happiness declined both absolutely and relative to that of men. The suicide prevalence in lower income countries is lower than in higher income groups, and in modernized societies, higher than in traditional societies. In Britain, while suicide rates have always been and remain much higher for men, roughly 3 times those for women, the rate of increase in suicide is steepest in young women between the ages of 10 and 24. This is in line with findings in other Western countries. There's an American psychologist called Jean Twenge who studied rates of psychopathology in adolescents, relying on serial, contemporaneous assessments using the same objective assessment tool and meeting stringent standards over the period from 1938 to 2007. So at a certain point in their secondary education, cohorts of school children were asked to answer a questionnaire about their mental well-being. What she found was, by avoiding the problems of retrospecting on these things and therefore using a different kind of criterion, but actually using a standard diagnostic pattern, she found that there were between 5 and 8 times as many students between 5 and 8 times as many students that met a common cutoff for psychopathology in the latest cohort compared with the earliest. And this may be an underestimate because many recent subjects were already stabilized on antidepressants, which wasn't possible in 1938. A major 2018 survey, which charts social isolation using a common measure known as the UCLA Loneliness Scale, shows, according to Harvard professor Arthur Brooks, that loneliness is worse in each successive generation. In the siloed or isolated worlds of cable television, ideological punditry, campus politics, and social media, people find a sense of community in the polarized tribes forming on the left and the right in America. Essentially, people locate their sense of us through the contempt peddled about them on the other side of the political spectrum. There is profit to be made here. The outrage industrial complex is what I call, says Brooks, the industries that accumulate wealth and power by providing this simulacrum of community that people crave but cannot seem to find in real life. Findings from the Cigna US Loneliness Index for 2018 include, and this is pretty staggering to me, when asked how often they feel like no one knows them well, more than half of the respondents surveyed said they feel that way always or sometimes. Approaching half of respondents felt that their relationships were not meaningful. More than half of adults aged 18 to 22, more than half of adults aged 18 to 22 identify with 10 of the 11 feelings associated with loneliness. Now, what I believe has happened at root is that we have failed to understand who we are as human beings, what the world is, and what we're doing here. These are ancient, important questions of philosophy, and I think recently we have completely lost any direction as to who we are, why we're here, and what we're doing. And it's the attempt to answer the question, who are we, that I wrote this book, The Matter with Things. And there are 3 broad conclusions about what has happened. In writing The Master and His Hemisphere, I already researched what happens to a people when they become deracinated from their culture and live isolated lives. There is evidence that actually still leading a life in which you belong with a culture and keep up the ways of life of that culture, even if they're not what we would think of as particularly healthy. It might involve drinking alcohol and smoking and not going to the gym. They have actually lower levels of cardiac morbidity and morbidity in general. They have lower rates of psychological distress, and generally live longer and more fulfilled lives. So our sense of being embedded in a social network is very important. And the important sociologist Emil Durkheim at the end of the 19th century showed us that when people are uprooted, it doesn't matter whether they go up the scale in wealth or power or down the scale in wealth or power, their chances of suicide are greatly increased. The second thing, which I'm sure you don't need introducing to, is that connection with the natural world is essential to our well-being, and that people who are deprived of it become angry, their cognitive function deteriorates, their emotional lives become shallow, they have great psychological distress. And if you bring children from backgrounds where they're deprived of contact with the natural world into a natural setting, even if it's only for a relatively short period, there are amazing changes that can be achieved. What this really shows us is that we belong in nature. Nature is not the environment. The environment suggests something around us, not us, but we are nature. We come out of nature, we go back to nature. And nature is where we belong, where we have our home, and it's that we are destroying. And the third is the realm of the spiritual. I didn't know this until writing this book. I researched it about 3 years ago and found that there was a largely uncommented on, but vast body of literature that shows that people who have a spiritual dimension to their life, in fact, it shows that belonging to a community that worships together is the most powerful, but just having a spiritual dimension to the way in which you look at life means that people lead perhaps unsurprisingly, more moral lives, but also are far more resilient, are less prey to psychological distresses, and are physically more healthy. Again, the effects of this parameter outweigh those of stopping smoking and going to the gym and losing weight, although those are very important. I'm not saying they're not important. What I'm trying to say is this spiritual idea that is so much held in contempt by many academics and people who ought to know better is actually very, very important to our lives. And the last thing that I want to talk about is shapes. Now, on the screen, you see William Blake's depiction of Jacob's ladder. And I have adopted that actually as the emblem of what is called Channel McGilchrist, which is my website. I always have to point out that this is not an imperative, it's just a noun, the Channel McGilchrist. But what is interesting about this is that it's the only example I know where Jacob's ladder doesn't simply stretch up into heaven, but it follows a spiral. And I think that all the natural processes of our lives actually follow this spiral. T.S. Eliot famously suggested that we arrive back at the place we started from and know it for the first time. But actually, we don't do that. What we do is we come round to almost where we were, but it slightly misses and goes up. And it's this process where we see where we were before, but can now appreciate that we've achieved something greater, which is the insight. And so we're always circling like this. What's beautiful about this is that if you look at a spiral down the core of the spiral, it looks just like a circle, which is static. But it's not. It's moving in depth, in 3 dimensions. But if you look at it from the side, it has this movement which is linear. So it's a very remarkable bringing together of the circular motion and the linear motion. Just to amuse you a little by an invective against linearity, I want to read to you something written by the Austrian painter and architect Friedensreich Hundertwasser. Here is a quote. In 1953, I realized that the straight line leads to the downfall of mankind. But the straight line has become an absolute tyranny. The straight line is something cowardly drawn with a rule, without thought or feeling. It is a line which does not exist in nature. And that line is the rotten foundation of our doomed civilization. The straight line is atheistic and immoral. The straight line is the only sterile line, the only line which does not suit man as the image of God. The straight line is the forbidden fruit. The straight line is the curse of our civilization. Any design undertaken with the straight line will be stillborn. Today we are witnessing the triumph of rationalist know-how, and yet at the same time we find ourselves confronted with emptiness. An aesthetic void, a desert of uniformity, criminal sterility, loss of creative power. Even creativity is prefabricated. We've become impotent. We are no longer able to create. That is our real illiteracy. Well, you can probably gather that Hundertwasser wasn't a great fan of the straight line. And the straight line is actually the way in which the models of the left hemisphere, simple, linear, serial ways of thinking, essential to bureaucracy, are the ways that we now think about everything. And it's the targeting, you see. The left hemisphere is the one that grabs something. And to target something is to see it with a straight line and go for it. But actually all the important things in life can't be achieved directly. With great respect to the American Constitution, you cannot pursue happiness. The more you pursue it, the less happy you become. Happiness is a byproduct of forgetting yourself. So I want to draw attention to curves, to spirals, and not to the linearity of our sequences. There's a necessary opacity of what matters to us. It's not easy to make it transparent. It's necessarily implicit in nature. Think of a poem. You explain it, it seems to have no power. Think of a joke. You explain it, it's no longer funny. All the things that are valuable. The divine is something that, if reduced to a few sentences, is nothing. All the important things. How do you explain to somebody what it means to be in love if they've never been in love? The words simply fail one. So there is a necessary implicitness in the important things in nature. And it's not irrational, but transrational or supra-rational to reject at certain times what reason can tell us. I'm a great fan of reason. I use it a great deal myself. But music, is it rational? Hardly. But is it irrational? Not at all. It's transrational, it's supra-rational, and it cannot be explained in linear terms or in language. So there are limitations in the way we express some things, and our obsession with clarity is at the expense of depth. So I always say that we should be clear as possible, and people say my writing is clear, which I take as a compliment, that I make complex things clear. I hope that is the case. I put a lot of effort into it. But one can be as clear as one likes, as far as it is legitimate, but not a whit further, because when you start to clarify beyond that point, you destroy what it is you're trying to explain. So what cannot be fitted into the Procrustean bed of our language and our concepts is thought of as unreal or insufficiently thought through, whereas in fact what it is signifying is something too deep for our usual ways of thinking. So I'm a believer in science. I am a scientist. It's always been a passion of mine from childhood onwards. I believe in reason and clarity, but I don't think we should push these things too far. And it's odd that it falls to someone like myself, who believes in these things, to point out their limitations. They have proper limits, and within those limits they are very powerful and tell us much. But pushed beyond those limits, they become an obstacle more than a vehicle to understanding. So finally, in conclusion, I would like to talk a little bit about values, just briefly, because it involves another shape. This is the hierarchy of values, which those of you who have read either of my major books will recognize. According to Max Scheler, who was a phenomenological philosopher. Unfortunately, he died rather young, but Heidegger said that he, Scheler, was the greatest philosopher in Europe of his generation, and that he alone actually understood Heidegger, which is quite a compliment. And in this pyramid of values, you see that, as far as he was concerned, at the bottom were those of utility and pleasure. Above them came what he called Lebenswerte, which are the virtues of vitality, things like courage, magnanimity, reverence, and so forth. Then above that came what are called the values of intellect, geistige Werte. Geist in German means both spirit and intellect, so it's a complicated word. But what he meant by this is things like beauty, truth, and goodness. And at the top was das Heilige, the holy. Now, in the way I see it, in the way Scheler saw it, this was the right way in which to approach this pyramid, that the values of simply use and pleasure are not to be neglected. They're important, but once they're fulfilled, we should move on to something higher. And the right hemisphere sees that each level of this pyramid is actually a way of serving something higher, ultimately the divine or the holy. But the left hemisphere has constructed things the other way around. So the idea of the holy is just a mechanism whereby a tyrannical priesthood tried to control the populace. The values of truth, beauty, and goodness, well, they're just to do with sexual selection and keeping a population quiet. The values of vitality, well, I mean, it's just as well that there's some poor suckers who don't realize that they're actually falling behind in the competition by giving people generosity and magnanimity. They should be being more selfish. And ultimately, it's all in the service of use and pleasure. This is a terrific inversion. And if we really hold that this is the case, then we don't deserve to survive. What to do about it? Well, I think in brief, and I'm sure you want to ask me more, and I probably won't have any answers, I think it's up to each of us to push back against devitalization, dehumanization, deanimation, bureaucratization, proceduralization, and the culture of that process that overlays the whole of our current lives. Of course, it has implications for how we educate the young, which is too obvious for me really to spell out at this stage. And I think there needs to be a reversal of our feelings about the spiritual realm as something deeply important to life, not a kind of fashion asset like a certain kind of sportswear or something. Well, I do spirituality and I light a candle. And all. No, it's got to be deeper than that. So we may or may not survive. But for it to matter that we survive, we need to stop seeing the world as a heap of resource for us to exploit and see it rather as being a proper object of awe. That saving the rainforests, preserving the life of the seas, is not about saving our economies or even our skins, but is of ultimate importance because they are the living testimony to, the living expression of, a cosmos that is beautiful, rich, complex, conscious, I believe, and responsive, and which in itself speaks to us of the sacred and the divine. Thank you very much.